Many people today think of international relations as if the world of diplomacy was run like a model UN. However, this naive way of thinking ignores the fact that there is a very real hierarchy in the international community, and very few nations see eye to eye. One can observe that since the 90s, the US of A has enjoyed undisputed hegemony. They have the biggest economy, the strongest army, and the most diplomatic prestige. This has led many intellectuals to call out their dominance as a new form of imperialism. Yarvin is one of them, but his critique is the complete opposite of what most people expect. When most people think of critics of US policy, they think of Chomsky and a general left-wing critique of capitalist imperialism taking advantage of the undeveloped third world. Curtis Yarvin, also known under the pseudonym Mencius Moldbug, could be best seen as the anti-Chomsky. He writes that the real problem with American foreign policy is that it believes that it is helping the world, but in fact, its apparent humanitarian and caring foreign policy, fostered by people like Chomsky, has only resulted in chaos and war. He argues that the US acts like an unknowing arsonist that throws gasoline into every fire it can find because it actually thinks that gasoline is water. So, in this essay, I will go over Yarvin's main arguments on international issues in the most concise way that I can manage. At the end of the essay, I will give my own opinion on his ideas and list his main essays that you should read if you are interested. Finally, I want to thank Parker Banks that helped me with the Yarvin quotes in the video version of this essay. Chomsky's indignation is pointed square at self-interested American imperialism. According to this argument, imperialism has changed forms many times, from the openly colonialist conquest of the Philippines to the Cold War era support of anti-communist dictators like Pinochet and Diem for geopolitical interests, to the most recent form embodied in the different military investments that hope to give the Bush administration a political boost under the guise of bringing democracy to Iraq. For the purposes of this essay, we will call this type of American imperialism the Red Empire. It is called the military-industrial complex by its opponents, but in real terms, it is made up of the Department of Defense, and it is usually supported by the neocons in the Republican Party. The arguments against the Red Empire, leveled by Chomsky and co., is that it is a capitalist and imperialist oppressor of the global south, which has led to millions of deaths caused by its puppet dictators and its military interventions since the Cold War. These feelings are also very common in Western Europe and in the US itself. Most of these critiques believe that the solution is to empower the oppressed peoples to rebel against the Red Empire, against capitalist imperialism, and replace this system of oppression with a policy where all problems will be solved through diplomacy by the international community. It is common sense that in the Cold War, the Americans backed several dictators in their fight against communism. In Cuba, they backed Batista, while the Soviets backed Castro. The same pattern was also present in China with Chiang and Mao, and in Vietnam with Diem and Minh, respectively. However, this view of American foreign relations has a lot of little-known inconsistencies that it cannot explain. For example, in the Chinese Civil War, we find that the US declared an arms embargo against nationalist China, which was supposed to be their ally. This happened when the nationalists held the undisputed upper hand in the Civil War. This was done to aid the Marshall Mission, which wanted to arrange a ceasefire between the two factions. In this ceasefire, the communist side gained strength due to Soviet help and surrendered Japanese arms, and started winning the Civil War when it resumed in 1948. In the same year, the State Department also recommended that the US should recognize the new communist government of China in the China White Paper. It would not be a total exaggeration to say that Mao Zedong would have never won the Chinese Civil War without US intervention. This pattern was again repeated in the Cuban Revolution, where the US again imposed an embargo on their nominal ally, the Batista regime, which led to the defeat of this regime against Castro's revolution. Furthermore, in 1959, 3 months after his victory, while thousands of dissidents had already been shot, Castro was warmly received at Harvard Law School, where he gave a speech and answered questions from the faculty. And finally, The pattern is repeated once again in the end of the Vietnam War, where the US withdrew from South Vietnam in their policy of Vietnamization, where the US promised it would help South Vietnam to fight on its own while they evacuated their own troops. However, after evacuating their own troops, the US refused to support them. Congress passed the Case-Church Amendment, which prohibited the use of funds to, quote, to support directly or indirectly combat activities in South Vietnam, end quote. The military aid was drastically reduced after 1973, and the economic aid was also reduced from $2.3 billion in 1973 to $1.1 billion in 1974. This demoralized the South Vietnamese, encouraged the North Vietnamese to invade, and led to massive shortages in the South Vietnamese army as well as an economic crisis. It is no wonder that South Vietnam collapsed like it did. All these inconsistencies stir up some interesting questions that cannot be answered by the pure America bad narrative. So why did the US indirectly and directly help both Mao and Castro despite them being sworn enemies? And why did the US not help their ally South Vietnam when they needed it the most? And why was Castro later invited to tour the US after winning a bloody civil war under the flag of revolution? Well, Yarvin's answer to these inconsistencies is that the US government does not act as one monolithic entity, instead that the different departments act independently with their own agendas and their own rivalries, not unlike the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy in World War II. According to this hypothesis, parts of the US government opposed Castro, while others helped Castro, that some department wanted to help South Vietnam, while others wanted to abandon them. Yarvin's explanation for these historical inconsistencies is the two-empire hypothesis. This hypothesis states that the US government is made up of two rival factions which compete with each other on the international stage. On one side, we clearly have the Red Empire, which supported Batista, Chiang, and the Vietnam War. But at the same time, we can clearly observe concrete efforts such as arms embargoes that directly undermine the efforts of the Red Empire. But who is responsible for them? In the case of the embargoes, they were all enacted by the Department of State. The State Department and the military have long had a complex relationship, and these three cases show that these two departments often directly undermine each other's efforts. However, the Department of State is not alone in opposing the military efforts of the Red Empire. If we take the example of the Iraq War, a Department of Defense adventure, we can also observe vehement opposition by international organizations such as the UN, the EU, but also from almost all international NGOs, from the humanities faculties in almost all universities, and finally from the international press itself. Curtis states that these institutions make up another international power. They call themselves the international community, but Yarvin calls them the Blue Empire. Everybody knows the Red Empire because it exerts influence through military action, but the Blue Empire is much less obvious because diplomatic power is much harder to see than tanks and soldiers rolling down the street. Therefore, I think that it is important to go over what Yarvin defines as quote-unquote the Blue Empire. The difficulty with the idea of the Blue Empire is that all these institutions that oppose the Red Empire are nominally independent. No one is controlling them all behind the curtains, but yet there seems to be no real ideological disagreements between the US Department of State, the UN, the EU, and the international NGOs such as Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, etc., and the international relations faculties around the world. All of these organizations share the same progressive worldview and work to further human rights. This implies that despite there being no central committee, these organizations act as a bloc and together wield much international power. Yarvin argues that the reason that these organizations agree with each other is that the people that staff these organizations come from the same university faculties. The ideas that blossom in the international relations faculties are carried into these institutions by each new generation of graduates. If you agree with Moldbug's analysis, we can establish that there is such a thing as an international progressive alliance. However, it is still unclear how this alliance of diplomats, aid workers, and human rights activists actually exerts enough power at an international level to be considered an empire. One can certainly argue that diplomacy is more powerful than direct military action, at least today. Through diplomacy, one can exert an incredible amount of soft power without firing a single bullet. This means that it is much harder to see the Blue Empire's influence, even though it is much stronger than the Red Empire. At least Yarvin argues, and I do agree with him. But let's try to make the existence of the Blue Empire more concrete. So let's list the tangible powers that the Blue Empire has today. The first thing to notice is that the Blue Empire has great economic power. In a world where all developed countries depend economically from trade with one another, international diplomacy has great economic importance. The diplomatic relations between countries directly determine trade, investment, and economic stability. Therefore, diplomatic power can easily be translated into economic pressure through tariffs, embargoes, and sanctions. The economic power of US diplomacy can be clearly seen in the sanctions placed on the Russian economy after the escalation of the war in Ukraine. The only reason that the Russian economy has not collapsed is because of their oil trade with India and China, and their relative self-reliance. The thing is that not all countries are as self-sufficient as Russia is. That means that the US has the effective power to sink the economy of most nations around the world. This power does not even have to be used most of the time to exert influence. The mere threat of being cut off is enough to persuade most. Furthermore, when two countries, let's say Georgia and Uzbekistan, trade with each other, they almost always trade using dollars. There are a couple of recent exceptions where dollars are not used, but the world economy spins around the dollar. Not to mention that almost all countries, US friendly or not, have their monetary reserves in dollars. This gives further power to the US since depriving a nation of dollars will directly impact the amount of trade that such a nation can do. One good example of the power of international institutions is the process of decolonization of both British and French empires. Despite the resistance of both empires in Suez and Algeria, they found themselves diplomatically isolated while their enemies, or the enemies that they were facing, which were Nasser's Egypt and the Algerian NLF, received diplomatic and military aid from both the Communist Warsaw Pact and the Western powers. With the power of diplomacy, the Blue Empire pretty much sealed the fate of the British and French empires by leaving them isolated. But arguably, the strongest weapon of the Blue Empire is ideological, or propagandistic if you wish. It has successfully convinced most of the world that their influence is good, that they fight for human rights, for peace, and democracy. Indeed, the institutions of the Blue Empire, such as the UN, are disliked not because many people disagree with its ideals, but because they think that it doesn't do enough. As a result, most people around the world support the actions of the Blue Empire, and indeed gleefully cheer for its expansion. Expansion, in this case, is normally called democratization or regime change. Of course, there have been many successful recent examples of regime change in Libya, Ukraine, Serbia, etc. All these changes in regime were remarkably similar. First, the opposition to the government grew. It became more popular. Then there were protests in the streets. The government panics and cracks down on the protest, and therefore the government is condemned by the international community and either steps down willingly or is torn down with help from without. When looking at the section in Wikipedia about color revolutions, it is written that the causes of these revolutions in Ukraine, in Georgia, etc., were, quote, authoritarianism, electoral fraud, human rights violations, kleptocracy, and political corruption. So, it would be fair to conclude that the worse these things get, the higher the likelihood of a revolution. But yet, I do not really see any revolutions brewing in North Korea. But then, why did Yanukovych and Mubarak get a revolution, but not Kim, who is certainly worse? Yarvin's response to this is that the reason behind the Arab Spring or the color revolutions was not actually authoritarianism or the corruption of their government, but the amount of American influence in their politics. Let's imagine that you are a young, ambitious, up-and-coming professional and you want power. In the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, you have to suck up to the Kim family. There is simply no other way to political power. If you are in Assad's Syria, you can also suck up to the Assad family, the Ba'ath Party, and the Alawites as a whole, but you can also appeal to the international community to be a friendly replacement for Assad if regime change were ever to happen. Therefore, a rival power center forms inside of Syria's educated class, and this center is nurtured by a sympathetic international press. When the time is ripe, this rival power center is the vanguard of regime change. This is exactly the strategy that happened in Syria and that brought them to civil war, but also the strategy that successfully brought down the USSR and many other regimes since. You can prefer to call the Blue Empire something else like the international community, but I think that Yarvin is right to point out that this is a very real structure that can exert very real power on the international stage. Indeed, I would argue that the Blue Empire has client states in the majority of the world, and certainly in the majority of Europe, almost all of Latin America, and it also has much influence in Africa and Asia, especially through humanitarian aid. The countries in the sphere of the Blue Empire are also exclusively liberal democracies or anti-colonial movements. On the other hand, the resulting defeats of their allies in Cuba, Vietnam, and China have cost the Red Empire valuable friends and much political power within the government. The result of these defeats, plus the more recent ones in Iraq and Afghanistan, is clear. The Red Empire today is just a shadow of its former self, and the military has lost almost all of its former prestige that it had in the post-war years. As a result of this long string of lost wars, the Red Empire extends only to a few strategic allies with militaristic tendencies, such as Israel, Egypt, South Korea, Taiwan, etc. But it is nothing compared to its former power, which still lives rent-free in Chomsky's head. I mean, they cannot even intervene in Venezuela, in their own backyard. Influence from the Blue and Red Empires are not mutually exclusive per se. For example, Ukraine is certainly in the spheres of both. However, most countries are more aligned with either the international community or the Department of Defense. However, I think it is important to mention that the Blue Empire does not see itself as an empire, because it is not working in its own interest, but for the sake of humanity. Its mission is to promote peace, democracy, and to defend human rights. The Blue Empire sees itself as a sort of universal enforcer of human rights, and as a sort of universal charity with a mission of making the world a better place. Certainly, I've met people who have studied international relations and many more who are genuinely devoted to promoting human rights. These people seem perfectly sincere to me in their wish to make the world a better place, and one is really hard-pressed to look at the Blue Empire in a negative light, especially when one was born inside of it. At least in terms of PR, it is really difficult to go against the actions and principles of the international community. I mean, what is the alternative? Should I start simping for Khamenei and mourning Gaddafi? Is that what the base kids are doing nowadays? But even though the Blue Empire's PR might be really good and its intentions might be completely pure, the real question that one must ask is if they actually make the world a better place according to their own mission. Do their actions actually result in peace, democracy, and human rights? Yarvin primarily focuses on the Arab Spring to highlight the contradictory altruism of the Blue Empire. Surely, when the international community supported the revolutions across the Arab world, they had the best intentions in mind. The regimes that they brought down were certainly backwards and oppressive, and the international community expected that the result of these revolutions would be a surge in democracy and peace across the Middle East. 10 years later, we can see that this has not really come to fruition. The best case scenario, as seen in Tunisia, was the fall of President Ben Ali, who had been in power for 23 years and open elections. However, Tunisia has since slid back into authoritarianism under the rule of President Kais Saied. In the worst cases, which are better known, the result of revolution is a brutal civil war, such as in Syria, Yemen, Libya, and Sudan too, arguably. The war in Syria is still ongoing after 11 years and has led to deaths of more than 500,000 people. In Yemen, we find something similar, an eternal civil war with around 400,000 deaths, but an active famine. And we also have two civil wars in Libya with a total of some 50 to 60,000 deaths because there's not a lot of population there anyhow. And not to mention that the rise of ISIS is also part of the aftermath of these Arab revolutions. In the best case, the Arab Spring led the country right back to where it started. In the worst, it set off ethnic and religious-fueled civil wars with over 1 million dead and no end in sight. But at least it was all done with good intentions, right? There was no way that all of this could have been predicted, except that the results were entirely predictable. One must only look at the long-standing and bloody struggles between authoritarian regimes and Islamic militants in the Arab world. The examples are many: the Algerian Civil War, the Mecca Siege of 1979, the Islamic insurgency in Syria in the 70s and 80s, and of course the successful Iranian Revolution of 1979. If one were to destabilize these authoritarian regimes, one would expect their opponents, both ethnic and religious, to gain power and fight for supremacy, not the establishment of a liberal democracy. So we have two options. Either the good-hearted humanitarians that represent the core of the Blue Empire are well-intentioned but stupid, and their naivete has led to over 1 million deaths, or that they were neither innocent nor good-hearted. Which is it then? Yarvin certainly has his own opinion.
When you are motivated by genuine charity and your charitable efforts backfire and actually harm the recipient of your help, you feel guilt and sorrow like nothing else. You're a witness to a horrific motorcycle accident. You run over to the man on the ground, pull his helmet off, hug him, and give him CPR. Unfortunately, he would have been fine, except that you just severed his spinal cord. How do you feel? Is your reaction, "Oh well, at least I tried"? How did the American people react when their Arab experiment didn't go so well? I'll tell you exactly how they reacted. "Oh well, at least we tried." And then they changed the channel.
But what was the real motivation behind the Arab Spring? Why did the international community support it? Perhaps the average lib can be excused for being naive. He just sees some good chirpy rebels and some mean dictator, just like Star Wars. However, I'm not willing to accept that the diplomats of the State Department and the international relations faculties are incapable of seeing the risk of encouraging revolutions in historically unstable countries. This leaves us with either sadism or Machiavellianism in those that are not naive. Yarvin actually argues for both.
I'll tell you what the real emotion behind the Arab Spring was. Actually, Beavis can tell you better. "Fire is cool," said Beavis. Fire is indeed cool. Americans were bored and needed some better CNN. They wanted to see shit burn. Shit indeed burned and is still burning, which was cool. So they got what they wanted. Not too different from the crowd in the Colosseum, just less honest about how they satisfy their very simple chimp human needs. And it's not just sadism that motivates callous altruism. Another source of venal satisfaction is that when you help people or appear to help them, you become a patron. You gain ownership over them. When you help overthrow the dictator of Egypt, for example, you become, in a sense, the new government of Egypt.
Of course, this is a heavy accusation that the good and caring people of the international community are in reality driven by the same things that motivated Attila the Hun, namely lust for power and conquest, just with better PR. But it is important to mention that historically speaking, almost all great empires have had some moral justification for their conquests. There have been few empires who have justified their wars specifically on the merit that they have a bigger army. Most wars have been declared in the name of self-defense, religion, or ideology. The British Empire conquered a quarter of the world with the justification of bringing civilization to the savages. The Soviet Union submitted Eastern Europe in the name of the workers and the peasants. Why should we expect the United States to be any different? Could the Blue Empire not further its own power in the name of human rights and democracy? This justification, just like its socialist counterpart, knows no borders. If the US decides that your country does not respect human rights enough, they will have the perfect justification to intervene diplomatically or militarily. This is the perfect casus belli because it could be effectively deployed against 90% of the world. Could you name a country that is immune to accusations of human rights violations that is not a de facto US satellite? An interesting example that comes to mind is how the US constantly nags Saudi Arabia on the representation of the LGBT community. Secretary of State Blinken literally states that, quote, "I press the Saudis on LGBTQI issues in every conversation," end quote. However, I think it would be disingenuous to compare traditional imperialism with modern blue imperialism. A traditional empire, much like the British or the Mongol Empire, conquered others for their own direct benefit, much like a wolf hunting deer. However, blue imperialism does not work like this. What is America getting out of Libya after bringing down Gaddafi? Because after the fall of the Gaddafi government, the international community declared Libya a democracy and forgot about them. Meanwhile, Libya fell into anarchy and it really hasn't recovered. So it would be fair to compare blue imperialism to an arsonist pouring gasoline over small flames and then turning them into uncontrolled fires that consume whole countries, all done without any direct benefit for the Blue Empire. Another controversial example of throwing gasoline over a fire was the American support of regime change in Ukraine. The removal of Yanukovych in 2014 would obviously trigger a war with Russia, in which thousands of Ukrainians would clearly die. This was obvious to any impartial observer. I can certainly understand why Ukrainians desired independence from Russia, and why they removed Yanukovych, since he wasn't exactly a saint. But from hindsight, the Maidan Revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity as they call it, and the subsequent war have been disasters for the Ukrainian people. If the international community, or the Blue Empire, truly cared about the well-being of Ukraine, they would have supported measures for an independent Ukraine that would have not led into a predictable war with Russia, with dire consequences for the Ukrainian people. And indeed, Yarvin argues that if the international community had not intervened in Ukrainian politics, then they would probably have somebody like Yanukovych in the presidency, some corrupt idiot. However, what's better, having a corrupt idiot or having a war? Yarvin, for all intents and purposes, is a very radical isolationist. Isolationist specifically in the sense that he is against the propagation of American ideology throughout the world. His position is that the US should not care for anything other than its own interests and not choose to take sides in foreign conflicts and disputes. In a very real sense, this means that the US should not care if tomorrow the Brazilian military performs a coup d'etat and establishes a new military regime, or if Morocco and Spain start fighting a war over Ceuta. Essentially, what he advocates for is to return to the world of international relations after the Treaty of Westphalia, where each nation cared first and foremost about their own interests and did not care what their neighbors did as long as it did not affect them directly. However, this is contrary to the modern world of international relations, since if Brazil experiences a military coup tomorrow, the international community would use all of its soft power, and maybe even some military power, to bring down the new regime by all means necessary because it is anti-democratic. This mentality, according to Yarvin, is a reason why Western Europe is no more independent than the members of the Warsaw Pact were independent. They can do whatever they want as long as it does not involve changing anything that the Blue Empire or the international community would not approve of, such as their borders, their internal policy, their foreign policy, their political systems, or their ideology. This level of control would be a transparent case of imperialism with any other ideology. The only difference between NATO and the Warsaw Pact is that today many more people subscribe to NATO's ideology and very few subscribe to international communism, not because Germany has any more real autonomy than the DDR. Yarvin argues for a complete end of this sort of democratic interventionism all across the world. In his opinion, this would lead to actual independence of most countries around the world, since the only political forces that would be relevant to this country would be local instead of international, and that this would lead to more effective government and the creation of effective autocracies around the world, which Yarvin, being a monarchist, clearly favors. A side effect of this isolationism is that wars would be shorter. The argument for this is that today the international community attempts to mediate conflicts and stop any violence without actually addressing the political reasons for any selected war. If the world would just let these wars play out, they would solve themselves. For example, when in 2023, last year, Azerbaijan decided to invade and ethnically cleanse the region of Nagorno-Karabakh of Armenians, the international community did not care, and the result ever since has been peace. The Armenians that were exiled from their homes have since resettled in other places, and Armenia has decided not to seek revenge since they know that they would lose such a war against the Azeris, which are better armed. This situation is reversed in the Arab-Israeli conflict, where there is no possibility of there ever being peace, since the international community guarantees an unstable status quo that leads to an endless string of wars between the two. Yarvin suggests that if the world gave as much attention to the Palestinians as they give to the Armenians, then they would be actually forced to negotiate a real peace with Israel or suffer the fate of the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. And either way, the war would end and everybody would soon forget about it. The same way that the French have forgotten about Algeria, where 2 million were expelled, and the Germans have forgotten about East Prussia, where 15 million were expelled, including my great-grandparents. Of course, all these wars and mass expulsions are great tragedies, but are they preferable to plus 80 years of revanchist war? Difficult to say.
We have simply observed that the old international law, generally perceived as brutal and bellicose, results in peace, and the new international law, generally perceived as civilized and humanitarian, results in war. It's all too easy to understand how irredentism and revanchism are the polar opposite of peace. Peace means accepting the results of history. Irredentism means the Welsh Liberation Front, demanding the return of London from those notorious human rights violators, the Saxons.
I personally quite enjoy Moldbug or Yarvin's analysis of international politics, even when I disagree with him. I always end up exploring a new chapter of history that I previously did not even know existed. But overall, I would say that in my opinion, Yarvin is better at criticizing the things that he doesn't like than arguing for the things he does want. He can make a very interesting case for isolationism. However, I think that this analysis is incomplete because isolationism, at least total isolationism, in the 21st century is as ambitious as flying to the moon in the 19th century. The world is so interconnected nowadays, both economically and ideologically, that it is practically impossible to cut oneself off from the rest of the world without crippling one's nation in the process. Even if the US did become isolationist, as Curtis would desire, this would not even mean that other nations would not expand their influence all the way to the US's borders. So, even though I do disagree with many of his conclusions, I also believe that his geopolitical analysis is very interesting, and I think that he illustrates the power of modern diplomacy and of the international community very well. I hope that you managed to take something interesting from this essay, even if it was only the historical anecdotes. The main sources that Yarvin has written about international relations are the following. I recommend reading whichever interests you. Just take in mind that Yarvin has an interesting writing style that might take some time getting used to.